Have you ever had a heavier weight yarn and been really confused as to how it was going to behave and what kind of patterns were going to really work well with it? Then this is the video for you, where we're going to look at all of those yarn weights and what they're going to work well with and things that you need to watch out for. So I'm quite a fan of slightly heavier weight yarns if you've got the right pattern for them. I'm going to take the ranges we've got over here. I'm going to go from double knitting or DK. Don't have a worsted here, but it's kind of going to sit here. Sometimes people will view this as double knitting. This heavier double knitting is almost a light worsted. Then you move into Aran weight, a little bit thicker, move over to chunky, and we've got a super chunky or bulky. So chunky and bulky are kind of used interchangeably depending on which country you're in. And these names are quite deceptive as well, because double knitting, I've seen it range anything from about like 22, 23 stitches per 4 inches. So really kind of in the, what I would view as a slightly heavier sports weight category, moving over into the light worsted. In Ireland, very often double knitting, like this Blosta yarn, would be closer to what the US would know as worsted, or a lighter worsted weight. So the worsted weight, we don't really have that in Europe very often. That's much more of a US yarn weight. And it tends to be like around kind of 19, 20 stitches per 4 inches would be where I would view the kind of the little slot for the worsted weight gauge. And then Aran weight, again, this is another one that varies a lot. Traditionally, I always think of 18 stitches per 4 inches or 10 centimeters as that little sweet spot for Aran weight. I've seen it move much thicker as well, where it's going into more like 17 or 16 stitches per inch, particularly if you're a loose knitter and if you've got kind of like a bumpy yarn for an Aran weight, like a tweedy Aran weight. The bumps tend to kind of catch on the needle and are going to be much more likely to give you a slightly looser gauge, even though the yardage, when you look at it, wouldn't really indicate that. Then when you're moving over into the thicker weights, for the chunky or the bulky is going to be something like this, where like this one is soft chunky, which is a tweedy Donegal yarns spun. And I'm just taking a look at the yardage on this. This one is showing about 125 meters in 100 grams. So little bit heavier, so less yardage. The thicker you get, the less yard you're going to get in the weight, because the yarn gets much fatter. So the fatter the yarn, the less length you get, because the weights stay the same. These are all 100 grams. So it makes total sense. If you stretch something out longer, you get a longer length or a longer yardage. If you make things fatter, it squeezes it in and it makes shorter yardage. I often think of like making strips or strings from dough or Play-Doh or plasticine, anything like that. You can see you'll start with the same amount, but depending on how fat you make that, you can make it longer or you can make it shorter. So if you think of yarn like that, because it is sold by weight, one has to give. You're either going to get a finer yarn with more yardage or a fatter yarn with less yardage for that same weight of yarn. The super chunky, it's going to be big fat stitches, and that can vary. You can even get like, there's other words for when it gets even bigger than this, but it just gets very, very fat. And it's good for small accessories and for things where you want to create a lot of drama, but it's obviously going to be very heavy and very dense, particularly when you start moving into superwash. So that's always a problem as you start moving into the heavier yarns, is the items get heavier. We're just pausing the video for a second to remind you that if you're enjoying the video, give us a thumbs up down below, because that way we know which videos you're liking and we'll make sure that we make more of them. So back to the video now. So that's kind of one of the first things we'll take a look at is, you know, what things work well with different patterns. What I'm wearing here is something called the Iced cardigan. It's a free one from Knitty magazine that I did years ago. And the original version is done, it's a chunky yarn or bulky yarn, and it's a mix between cotton and acrylic. And normally I'm not a huge fan of acrylic, but it's one of those cases where it actually is to your advantage, because cotton is very heavy, particularly as you start getting chunkier with the cotton. So if you mix that with something like acrylic, which is much lighter, it means that you get a yarn that behaves a little bit better. This one here is Soren, and Soren is done in this yarn, so it's a chunky yarn and you get nice big stitches. And to counteract the weight in that one, because I've got two things. First one is it's knit a little bit more loosely so it doesn't get so dense, and it was also kept a little bit cropped so you don't have quite the same weight. So that's something you can also take a look at when you're doing something with the chunky yarn, is can you make it a little bit shorter, so that either allows it to grow a little bit in length, and it also gives you the opportunity to actually have less weight, because there's physically less fabric there as well. My big preference for those chunky ones are things like hats are really good, cowls are lovely, big stitch patterns. You want to avoid things like cables, which are going to add even more to the density, because unless you're doing a really small item, because it literally will get so heavy that it's going to weigh it down. Double knitting and worsted weight are going to be much more forgiving, that they're sitting in that, it's just a little bit over sports weight. So it's a small bit heavier, a small bit bigger, but it's not quite as heavy yet as the Aran weight. So this is a very versatile weight, particularly when it's woolen spun. I like it a lot for doing cables, because it's still small enough or fine enough that you can get a lot of details in there, and it's not going to create too much weight. So for garments, double knitting, or even moving into Arans, they're pretty good for creating garments. I have got, do I have one here? Here we go. This is Umore, and this is done in our Jas yarn. And it's done Aran weight, knit slightly looser, so not a very tight gauge, and it's got a small little bit of weight, but it's not too bad. And the reason for that is the yarn itself, as it's woolen spun, has a lot of bounce, and it removes a lot of the weight, and it's knit tiny little bit more loosely rather than very tight and compact, so you're just not getting the same density. Again, you have the potential for things to grow with the heavier weight yarn, so watch for that, and you can check for it when you're blocking. So often with those, what I'll do is I'll check the swatch when I've knit it to kind of see what size it is. Then when I've blocked it, I will double check to see how much length I've gotten. If I'm worried about it growing as it's being worn, what you can actually do is, when it's still a little bit damp, or even after it's dry, get clothes pegs, hang one on the bottom of it, and then pin it vertically. So that's just to simulate the weight of having a bit of fabric on the bottom, and it'll give you an idea how much it can stretch vertically when it's being worn. So that's another way of just giving an idea of if the yarn is likely to grow. Just one or two clothes pegs sitting on the side of a swatch while it's hanging for a little bit. Give it a couple of days to see if you get any growth. You may not, because again, if it's not too heavy, if it's a yarn that has got a good bit of cohesion or wooliness, it'll kind of have a bit more grip side to side. If you're moving into something superwash and heavier yarns, you will definitely get considerable growth just by virtue of the weight of it. So when you're finding garments and you're trying to figure out how they're going to work, like I said, take a look at ones that aren't knit too tightly. Don't go for heavily cabled or heavily textured projects, because it's going to add more bulk to it, and kind of veer towards slightly shorter things, or things where if it does stretch a little, it won't take away from the garment. It's still going to work very well, but it's actually perfect. The big chunkier, the heavier ones for lovely big hats. You can go they create a lot of drama and huge big cowls. So think drama when you think super chunky is the best way to think of it. And have fun with your knitting. If you want to get some pattern ideas, pop into Stolen Stitches. You'll see you can actually just search by different weights and figure out what one's going to work best for the yarn that you've got, or you can see different yarn ideas. You can also, of course, look in Ravelry is a very good spot. Search by the yarn weight and take a look at the different types of patterns available, and bear in mind some of the points that I've touched on, so you'll know if something potentially you run the risk of it kind of growing or not really lasting very well, because when you knit something, you want to make sure it lasts. So have fun with your knitting.